On the 7th of June 1951, inside of Landsberg Prison, a former concentration camp guard made his way into a courtyard where he gazed up at the gallows and the execution structure that would shortly end his life. George Schallermair was accompanied by many American military policemen and a priest, and he was helped up the steps of the execution scaffold before the executioner placed a black cap over his head, followed by the noose around his neck. George Schallermair was a guard who had been sentenced to death for a number of reasons, and he was a man who was considered one of the most barbaric who worked inside of Dachau and its subcamps. He was a man who, like many former SS guards, would go to his execution inside of an Allied prison for his crimes. Join us today as we look at the execution of the evil guard of Dachau, and as always, to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. George Schallermair was born on the 29th of December 1894 inside of Hebertshausen, and little is known about his early life. But for a career before the Second World War broke out, he worked as a builder. He was a member of the Nazi Party and was a strict follower of Hitler's politics, like so many people were across Germany at the time. But during the guise of the conflict, he would become a brute and a barbaric guard who served inside of the concentration camps. Schallermair served inside of the German army in the Wehrmacht until 1944, and he would then be drafted across to the Waffen-SS, and he would serve under the SS inside of the concentration camps. It's not known why Schallermair switched from the army to the concentration camps and why he left the front lines. One possibility is that he could have been injured in combat and then drafted to guard prisoners like many who were wounded would. Many concentration camp guards were sent the other way to the front lines at this time during the Second World War as things got desperate for the German army and they needed more forces to defend the Reich as they were being pushed back heavily. But from August 1944 to May 1945, Schallermair served under the Commandant, Walter Adolf Langleist, inside of the Mulhdorf concentration camp. This was a subcamp of Dachau and was found not too far from it, and the prisoners here were to work inside of underground tunnels, making the Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter aircraft, which was considered one of Hitler's wonder weapons. The conditions at Mulhdorf were absolutely awful. The SS guards carried out selections at the camp, and prisoners who were sick or suffering, and those who had been injured, were sent to Auschwitz, and within hours of arriving at the camp, they had been exterminated inside of gas chambers and the deadliest concentration camp. In fact, more than half of the prisoners who were sent to Mulhdorf would be sent to the killing chambers of Auschwitz-Birkenau, or they died at the site from overwork, shootings and executions, disease and violent beatings at the hands of the guards, such as George Schallermair. Prisoners were forced to work 10 to 12-hour days, carrying incredibly heavy bags of cement around. They were given hardly any food or access to sanitation. As the American army approached the site at the end of the war, the SS guards evacuated around 3,600 prisoners on death marches from the site. George Schallermair in particular was known for being a brutal guard. It was said that he was responsible for the conditions of the camp, along with the other guards, and for the lack of care given to the prisoners, which led to the deaths of a large number of inmates through illness and starvation. He was also accused of having beaten many prisoners to death with his bare hands, and also in administering beatings that were not asked of him, meaning he took the law of the camp into his own hands. He was also, shockingly, accused of a particularly heinous crime, and that was having overseen the removal of gold teeth from those prisoners who died and forcing an inmate doctor to do this. It was said of this specific crime that George Schallermair, as leader of the Roll Command, was directly responsible for the prisoners in Mulhdorf, a subcamp of Dachau. He himself beat many prisoners in such a way that they died of the result. Of 300 people who were brought to the camp in autumn 1944, only 72 were alive after 4 months. Every day he visited the morgue with a dentist, imprisoned, to break out the dead gold teeth. Many witnesses later came forward about the work of George Schallermair, and he was at the end of the Second World War brought to trial for his actions. The deaths that occurred at Mulhdorf were recorded in the camp's records, and it was said that Schallermair was a typical SS brute and a thug who had no regard for the lives of prisoners. When he spoke out in his defence, Schallermair claimed that he was only keeping law and order at the camp, that he only ever punished inmates who had committed serious violations of the rules, and that he did this to keep prisoners in line. He also claimed he had never killed an inmate, and regarding the removal of prisoner teeth, he claimed he'd actually been instructed to do this by a higher SS officer. However, on the 23rd of September 1947, the courtroom found George Schallermair guilty of war crimes, and he was sentenced to death, and was specifically to be sentenced to death by hanging. Before his death sentence was carried out, there were a number of reviews that confirmed his sentence. During one review it was said that the evidence clearly shows that the fact the defendant, as an SS Hauptscharführer and rapport leader in the Mulhdorf subcamp, was involved in the mass crimes in connection with the Dachau concentration camp. It is also clearly proven that the defendant personally abused and beat numerous camp inmates. Many of the inmates died as a result of the defendant's brutal beatings. The evidence justifies a guilty verdict. The sentence is not overly harsh. But in the years following this, there were calls by many people inside of Germany to release the prisoners who were sitting on death row, awaiting their executions in Landsberg Prison. Sometimes it took years for prisoners to be sent to the gallows, and many spent a long time inside of the prison before it was time for their date with the executioner. In fact, Hermann Pister, the commandant of Buchenwald, even died of a heart attack before his execution date inside of the prison. There were many reviews that were carried out to see if there was any justification to release Schallermair from his death sentence, but ultimately it was said that there are no facts or arguments that could in any way justify grace in this case. This meant that the death sentence of Schallermair was confirmed, and other legal groups tried their best to gain some form of clemency. On the 6th of June 1951, 6 years after the Second World War had come to an end, the US Supreme Court rejected the final motions regarding Schallermair's possible reprieve, and they argued that sparing him could send a dangerous message and encourage right-wing pro-Nazi tendencies and beliefs inside of Germany. It would be just a day later that they would carry out the execution of the former guard who had been sat on death row for many years, awaiting his execution. On the 7th of June 1951, George Schallermair was told it was his time to go and meet the executioner. He left his prison cell, and with him was a priest who offered him final blessings, and many American military policemen. They led him out to the courtyard where the gallows was found, and Schallermair's arms and legs were secured at the bottom of the steps of the gallows, and his identity was then confirmed. He was then helped by the military policeman up the stairs of the gallows and onto the scaffold where the executioner greeted him. He checked the binding of his arms and legs, and then shuffled him over to where the trapdoor could be found. A photographer took a final image of George Schallermair with his arms held by American guards. Then the executioner placed a black cap over his head and then secured the noose around his neck. Schallermair was then sent crashing through the trapdoor, and he was executed and was left dangling for a number of minutes before his death was confirmed. George Schallermair was one of many former concentration camp guards who were sent to the gallows in the years following the Second World War, but what is striking is that he was a soldier for the majority of the conflict, but found himself within the camps for just over a year. But he quickly became a brute and a beast who was responsible for a huge degree of slaughter and suffering, and some of the crimes he was accused of were truly evil and barbaric. Despite the calls for clemency, he was another victim of the gallows of Landsberg Prison. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.